Just let you know what's going to happen. We are going to bring up Mr. Snowdon now. He'll be on a video feed. He's going to make some introductory comments. I'll then bash through as many questions as I can, and then it will be open to the floor. We've got a roving microphone, and it's a case of hands up, get your question in. If you're able to state who you are and your affiliation with your question, that's great, because it kind of helps. But if you'd rather not, that's fine. It's not mandatory. So I think, hopefully, we're about ready to go. Shall we see? Ah, there we go. Good afternoon,
Can you hear me?
Snowdon.
Good to be with you. Can you hear me all right?
I can hear you fine. Can you hear me?
I can.
Fantastic. Well, in that case, I think we've done a good job of introducing you, so it's pretty much over to you. We'll hear you in this, and then,
Sure.
then we'll pick up afterwards. Thank you.
Sure. All right. So, I mean, typically I would start with a little bit of a history lesson, but because we've had one of the gentlemen on stage give a version of it, I'll let that to the side and wait for questions to address that. And instead, just think about what's happened, what's changed. You know, five years. It's been 5 years, ladies and gentlemen, since I came forward and spoke the unspeakable. Clearly left a few people sore, which is disappointing, because this wasn't about hurting feelings. This was about proving to journalists an essential truth, something that people did not know. And if you said back pre-2013, people would look at you like you were crazy. You're a conspiracy theorist. And that's that the most private moments of your life were being watched and recorded. Now, you know, 5 years feels like a long time. And I had thought, initially speaking with the journalists when we were working on the story, that this was going to be a 2-week story. People were going to put it away and, you know, move on. The next crisis, the next scandal would happen. Because people wouldn't really care. But the strange thing is actually the inverse has happened. You know, here we are 5 years later. Collection and the abuse of data is not only still being talked about, it's being talked about more than it was in 2013. The thing is, that's not enough. If you look around at the world and what's happening, the challenges that we're facing now, they're larger than ending a program, than reforming a law. The problem is deeper. It has become structural. And we realize now, only in hindsight, looking back from where we are now to where we came from, that we are in the midst of the greatest redistribution of power since the Industrial Revolution. Now, normally I'd go on about what I mean by that, but I think everyone in this room already knows. Everybody from bureaucrats to businesses are working on programs to compile perfect records of private lives. This idea that we grew up with, that we had, that the oldest among us took for granted, the unconsidered thought, the youthful indiscretion, right? The forgotten mistake. They're starting to sound quaint. You know, who remembers precisely what they were doing on this very evening, even just a few weeks ago? Not you, probably, not me. But our friends at the GCHQ, they do. You know, they've got more lists than Santa Claus. And the problem is that you're on it, and I'm certainly on it. It's no longer a selection problem, where it used to be, you know, in the traditional days of targeted surveillance, you would have the bad guys. You would have the Russian general of the Missile Corps. You know, you'd have the Chinese director of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something like that. You'd have Osama bin Laden and, you know, a handful of miscreants and malcontents. They've moved to a regime of mass surveillance, or as they like to euphemize it, bulk collection. This changed it from a selection problem, picking which people go on the list and which people get watched, to a ranking problem, meaning we're all watched by default, no matter our innocence. And the question is just, how high up on the list are you? Do you actually pop up on the desk? Do your emails, sit there on the screen for the analysts when they walk in to go through? Some of you in the room, maybe even most of you, may be okay with the government's surveillance capabilities. Right? Some of you worked at intelligence agencies or, are related to these things. And you know they have done good work. Right? You know they have protected people. You know they have spied for good. And you might admit more privately that they've, gone beyond the line a few times too. But what about the corporate side of this? The anonymous men, in machines in faraway rooms that are making lists too. People whose names you'll never know about and who your laws can never really control. Think about Facebook. Think about Mark Zuckerberg's pointed refusal to pretend the concerns of the British matter to him. His empty chair at every hearing as kind of an all too clear, visible reminder of your place in this new hierarchy that's being built. Facebook doesn't care about you. It doesn't care about your country. It doesn't care about your politics. It doesn't care about your national security. It doesn't care about your future. It doesn't care about anything but your data, and only your data. They are a surveillance company, and their product is you. Their product is the story of your life, the lives of your neighbors, your private preferences. It's the record of every article you've ever bothered to click, but it goes deeper than that. It's the people that you care about. They call it your social graph, right? And who means the most to you. It is the ideas that attract you and the things that repel you. It is a system designed to put your mind on a shelf with a price tag available to anybody who's got the money. And it works. We see that in the headlines. We see that amongst our friends. We see that in the ads that are pointed towards us. And some of you might say, well, that's just the things that I put out there online voluntarily. You'd be wrong, but for the sake of argument, let's make it a little bit more real. Let's make it about things that are more personal, the things that you're not offering to share. If I asked how many people in the audience have a smartphone with you right now, an iPhone or an Android phone, it's all of you. So I want to take you through an example, and there's going to be a mistake in this, but just bear with me if you know what it is. It's this idea that there's this Russian company, you might have heard about them, whose entire business is based on the idea of developing digital burglary tools. And they go by the name, the NSO Group, nice and bland and boring. Their product used to work something like this. They'd send you sort of a time-sensitive text message. It has a little hyperlink in it. Something they think you're likely to click, like a package delivery notification, or the details, or funeral arrangements, or a family member who died. And if you click this link, and because they can try 100 times, 100 different ways, eventually everyone does, your phone now belongs to whoever sent that message. Now, because of refinements in their product, because they've been successful, they've gotten a lot of customers, right? They've got more money to hire more developers. This product that's called Pegasus, it's now being reported that you no longer need to click anything. It's no longer victim operated, right? You don't have to make a mistake and click that link. So long as they can learn your phone number, no user interaction is necessary. They can pop your phone, right? And that means instantly the entire history of that phone, your phone, they can immediately copy. And everything that happens on your phone from that day forward, every place you go, everyone you call, everything you read, every photo, or because they can remotely turn on the camera and the microphone, everything that simply passes by, everything that your phone is a part of, they are a part of too. Now, I want you to just reflect on that capability. The fact that it's commercially provided, the nature of it being sold by this Russian enterprise, right? In their defense, they say they only sell this to legitimate customers, police and governments, only for the purpose of targeting terrorists and criminals, right? It's that good old national security argument again. How do you feel about that? Nobody likes terrorists and criminals, after all. Maybe it won't affect you. People like you. Ordinary people, right? They're safe. Let me add a little bit more detail. The NSO Group, and this is a real company and a real example, is, of course, not Russian. It's actually Israeli. which is something like an ally to the West. Does that make it less scary? Maybe you trust them a little bit more, right? It's only natural. We think aligned values and so on. The Israeli government surely has bought Pegasus from this private company. They can use it, but that doesn't bother you. What I want you to think about is who else has bought this, who else can use it, and how much you trust them. How about Saudi Arabia? And of course, I mean the people who just murdered Jamal Khashoggi inside their diplomatic compound in Turkey. Because Citizen Lab, a Canadian group of academic researchers, reported the day before his murder that these tools, Pegasus, from this Israeli company, had been found on the phones of his associates. This tool set is openly marketed as a legitimate product, right? Again, to all these governmental groups to save lives, right? But the reality is they had been monitoring the human network of a dissident for months, analyzing his plans and intentions. And then when they felt they understood enough, they killed him. Now, Haaretz, a Israeli newspaper, confirmed this week that the price NSO Group allegedly negotiated in secret with Saudi Arabia for the use of this system was $55 million. Now, what I want you to think about is that process of intelligence gathering, right? Which any signals officer or anyone else, they understand how this works. You don't just decide to murder someone who walks into your embassy. You certainly don't need to know from hacking that they're coming to your embassy because they've got to make an appointment, right? But what is the chain of consequences that leads you to decide this is a person worth murdering? Not somebody you'll just let slide by. This requires a lot of thinking. This requires a lot of intelligence. This requires a lot of monitoring. This requires, today, a lot of hacking using tools just like this. And that's really the takeaway. Jamal Khashoggi, a Saudi journalist who is living in exile in the United States, might still be alive today if the NSO Group was not a business, if their tools were not licensed for export by all these governments. This company sells a product that has a single purpose, and that is breaking into devices relied upon by private individuals, from journalists to judges, right? And I'm not kidding here, actually, to the president of the Mexican Senate, who was the leader of the opposition at the time. Their only product is access to your private life, right? To the thing that's sitting in your pocket right now. And the most important thing to understand out of anything I'm going to say tonight, ladies and gentlemen, is this. Under the laws of Israel, under the laws of the UK, under the laws of the United States, almost anywhere around the world right now, this is not considered a crime. This business model commercializes public insecurity. And commercializing public insecurity is the biggest threat to the future of cybersecurity that we face today. This is the promise of a world where not only is your mind for sale, as with Facebook, which we're already grappling and burdened enough with, but perhaps the lives of your neighbors, people like you, people you read, maybe even you as well. Now you might go, oh, I've got nothing to hide, and we'll get to that later. But the question that I ask you tonight should be familiar because you heard it 5 years ago. Our rights are being violated. First, it happened by governments, and there's no question, in fact, that what was revealed in 2013 was illegal activity on the part of both the United States government and the UK government. We should be clear about that. We have story after story that show that the programs they said were being used for national security were in fact being used broadly. They were being used against dissidents, activists, human rights groups. And the reason they had been classified in the first place was not to save lives, was not to protect national security, but according to their own top secret documents, and this is a UK document, not a US document, they had been classified because of fears of a, quote, damaging public debate around the scale of its activities that could lead to legal challenges It's about protecting reputations, not protecting lives. And when we see this, when we look at what's happening today, when we look at the Facebook, when we look at the progression from thinking to action, when we think about this dynamic bridge that we see from monitoring us, from predicting us, from then influencing us, as we've seen recently, to now acting against us, commercially enabled, there's only one question, and it has not changed. What are you going to do about it? Thank you.
Ed, thanks for those comments. It's a good way to open it up, definitely. I'm interested in the mobile phone malware you talked about, this system Pegasus. I mean, this isn't the first time we've heard of mobile phone surveillance malware being used against dissidents by countries. I just wondered what's new. Has something changed as a result of recent political decisions, cybersecurity decisions?
Yeah, one of the primary things is that we've let it go unchecked. We saw this happen, and it's, again, one of these gray areas that would presumptively be illegal. These are single-use tools that are only useful for breaking into, your phone, everybody else's phone. And mind you, it's a bit like a skeleton key. If it can be used against someone you don't like, it can also be used against you because of a software monoculture, right? An iPhone is an iPhone is an iPhone. Android phones are a little bit different, but typically they're in an even worse spot. And people haven't really thought about where this goes. Some people will, of course, defend this by going, oh, well, if they sell it to governments, that's fine. But okay, you sell this to the Saudis, then how do you know how the Saudis are going to use this? There's one of two choices the company can take. One is that they go, well, we want to see everyone that the government is targeting. One, they don't like to do this because then they're sort of accepting a kind of liability for this. So they go, we'd rather not know. And two, the governments are more comfortable with this because they don't want anyone to know who they're spying on. But what does this mean? And even if you presume like good faith on the part of the companies, you sell this to all of these authoritarian governments, Saudi Arabia, Russia, African regimes, God, the UK, you as a customer are going, oh, this is going to be fine. It's only to be used to people that we sell it to, but you have no way of controlling that. One of the easiest things these governments could do is immediately target one of their own insiders with this malware and just catch it and go, how did this exploit work? What was the vulnerability that was acting against? Can we now copy it? And now can we use it outside of the company's systems, outside of the company's methods, and repurpose it against the people who sold it to us, or to their allies, or to anyone that we're interested with this? And the problem with the NSO group, for them rather than for us, is that now we have evidence for really the first time, because this is not typical, and I want people to understand this. When you look at the people who have been targeted by this malware, we would not know any of this without the work of university researchers at the Citizen Lab in Canada. And they were able to, because of mistakes on the part of the company's tradecraft, unwind who had been targeted, how they targeted, the kind of messages that they were sending. And they saw that not only were they targeting journalists, if the journalists didn't click soon enough, they would target their citizens, or the journalists' children. And this is sort of the brave new world that we haven't seen. We've known these capabilities were possible. We've known there were people who were sort of operating in this sector who were trying to make it work, but it was normally happening domestically. Sort of former British SIGINT officers would, make their own little startup, and they'd sell to the British government, right? Just sort of in their retirement. If they find something, great for them. If they don't, no problem. But it didn't cross borders that frequently or beyond allies. Now it's going global. And here's the problem. Even if you think this is a good idea, you can't create a monopoly on a business model that only requires a few nerds in an office to hack at iPhones for a couple months. And what's happened is because we have failed to establish norms here. We have failed to punish the companies responsible for this, particularly when it's resulting in lost lives. And these aren't speculative, right? But these are sort of authoritative claims where we can follow the chain of consequences and it has a name and a face. What happens when the Chinese start doing it? The Russians start doing it, right? And we don't have evidence because, you know, people cleaned up their act after seeing these early actors start to fail and get caught, and they sort of revised their methods to be a little bit more capable. And now we are living in a world of pervasive insecurity. And the problem is the most sophisticated actors here, right? The ones with the first mover advantage. Israel, which is a technological powerhouse, right? The UK, the US. We crush our opposition in the area of, you know, electronic monitoring because we have the budgets, because we have the sophistication, because we have the people who really helped to design these networks. And we went, well, we'll use them for as long as possible, and then we'll lock these down when we think our competitors are starting to reach parity. But that's not how the world of technology works, right? You can't unring that bell. You can't lock these people out. We have opened the door to a world in which we actually stand to lose the most because we are the most connected. We are the most reliant upon these systems, upon these devices, because we're a wealthier, more developed nation. What are we going to do when adversaries and rivals catch up and we say, oh, it's time for a new treaty, it's time for a new norm, and they go, oh, no, 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 no. You've been doing this against us for decades. Now it's our turn.
As far as you're aware, was this Pegasus software on the phone of Mr. Khashoggi himself?
We don't know that. There would be kind of a presumption, but we have no access to it. We don't know. And if they were doing this operation in advance and were worried about it being forensically gathered or sort of turned over by, for example, his surviving spouse, one of the functionalities that's built into all these kind of malwares is this sort of melt function, it's called, where it just removes itself, it removes all the logs, and it wipes the trace. So most likely we will never know for sure. But we do know with some authority that his contacts, media colleagues, and again, personal friends, these people did have this malware on the phone in the advance of his killing.
Just in terms of for want of a better phrase, bumping people off overseas. I mean, what we've seen with the murder of the Skripals is you don't necessarily need kind of mobile malware like this. I mean, there's
still an open question of how did they find, you know, where these people live, you know, how they're acting, how they're living. Do you think the Russians can't hack? Right? Sure they can.
Just on that subject, I wanted to ask about the Fancy Bear hacking group, which I talked about earlier on. You know, we've obviously had an indictment now from the Department of Justice against these 12 members of Russian military intelligence, the GRU, who are named by the US certainly as members of what's come to be known as Fancy Bear. What do you make of that indictment, first of all?
Yeah, I mean, one of the interesting and I think positive steps that we see coming out of this is what you recognized sort of when you started the talk, which is we're seeing intelligence agencies really for the first time in living memory, starting to open the vest a little bit and say, here's some of what we know. This is the beginning of a road which I think is positive and useful for society because particularly when we have these sort of dynamics like we have today, where everything is so politicized, everything is so partisan. You've got one side of society that's just going, oh, it's not true. You know, don't believe it. It didn't happen. It couldn't happen. You know, we have to establish facts, right? We have to be operating from a common state of agreed facts. And the only way that you can establish a fact is to prove it, is to show it. Now, having worked for the NSA at the desk and used these kind of tools, I think actually they could know, and hopefully should know more for the gravity of the claims they're making, that establishes this is true beyond a reasonable doubt. It is a little bit frustrating that they haven't gone all the way in doing this, but look, in terms of positive first steps, I think we have to applaud anybody who's willing to abandon the old practices of just saying, this is what we know, trust us. And at least starting, you can see there's clear discussions on the inside of going, maybe we shouldn't ask for trust. Maybe we should establish and show why we should be trusted.
Isn't the slightly awkward thing about this, though, that the documents that you leaked all those years ago, the point you were trying to make was look at the scale of surveillance, and I don't think this is a good thing, paraphrasing it a bit. Doesn't the document that's come out prove that these tools are very useful for nation states to stop them interfering in each other's political processes? Doesn't, you know, the indictment of the Fancy Bear group say, well, hang on, there's reasons we have things like X key score and so on?
It's a great question, and this is actually one of the interesting things is It's weird that the intelligence services aren't making this argument themselves, right? This is one of the rare times that they could go, look, this is what it's all about. This is what it's for. But again, they didn't open the vest all the way. And the question is why, right? They're sort of dancing around. Why aren't they doing that? And that's because then it starts raising more questions of, oh, okay, well, how did you know this? And the answer is, of course, because they can ransack anybody's Gmail inbox, right? They can look at anybody's Facebook private messages. And if they can do that, then people go, well, how do we know it's only being used against these? And they just don't want to get into that thing, particularly in front of a court, because there's a real open question about basic rights protections. Would this mean they have to revise or reform their activities? But there's a larger question there, which is, was this actually what these programs were justified on the basis of? And of course, that's not true. These programs were not sold to us as they'll protect you from Russian hackers, right? They could have argued that, and it's very likely the public would have been like, hey, that's a great reason, let's pass a law. But instead, they instituted these programs without our knowledge, without our consent, without a vote, without any participation, certainly without any sort of authorizing law. And when they were later backfooted and asked, why is this happening? They said, well, it's because it's saving lives. It's preventing terrorist attacks. It's thwarting plots. And when we actually look at the track history of this, we see that that's not true at all. Forgive me, I'm looking for the document that I have on this. Well, I don't have it ready to go. But the actual justifications for these programs, again, where they were saving lives, they're stopping plots. But in the wake of them, in 2013, President Obama appointed 2 independent commissions of his sort of allies who had access to all top secret data in the United States. They interviewed the heads of the FBI, the CIA, the NSA, and they went, is this true? Are these programs, keeping us alive? And this is looking primarily at the very first program that was revealed in the papers, Section 215 of the Patriot Act, which was collecting the phone records of everyone in the United States and around the world without a warrant, without any sort of criminal concern or individualized suspicion, just got it all, right? And the idea was this would allow them to find the Al-Qaeda sleeper cells, right? And bust the rings and all that stuff. And they looked at, despite more than 10 years of operation in secret, without the press catching wind or anything like that, pre-2013, they established, and these are the government's words, not mine, they never stopped a single terrorist attack in the United States. Moreover, they said it didn't even make a concrete difference, their words, in a single terrorism investigation. In fact, the only time they had found it ever made any sort of usefulness at all in a terrorism investigation was in the case of a cab driver in Somalia wiring $8,500 back to his clan in Somalia. And they said even in this case, it wasn't a necessary power because they would have gotten the same information through traditional means, just requesting a warrant from the judge anyway, because by the time they had enough information to look this guy up in the system, right, they could have used a warrant. They could have gone to the judge and gone, look, we think this guy's up to no good. Here's why. The judge, of course, would have stamped off on it, particularly because it's a secret rubber stamp court that always says yes, and then go about their way, get access to the same thing. The real question is why they're going, these things, if you don't let us have these powers, basically you will die, your children will die, your neighbors will die, when there are good arguments to go, these programs will be useful. We can gather foreign intelligence, right? We might get an informational advantage. We might get a strategic advantage, right? We might get a cybersecurity advantage. And all of these things are interesting and useful. But instead they go, no, 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 give us these powers or your children will die. We are being sort of manipulated and we are being lied to and deceived in a very unfair way, which any one of these heads of these agencies will admit in private, but they won't in public. And this is the thing about 2013. People always think this is about surveillance. It's about surveillance. It's about surveillance. And I want to burn these agencies down. No, I think these things have done good work and they can do necessary work.
I'm sorry.
This is about democracy. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, we're slightly pushed for time, so I just want to, just if we can.
Sure.
The public debate that you've talked about, obviously there have been changes in the US, there have been changes over parts of legislation. In the UK, there are still ongoing legal proceedings. However, in terms of the wider public debate, to what extent can you say, look, we've had the debate, the public have looked at this, the public have moved on, and actually there's an argument to say, well, the public have now found out about it, thanks to your disclosures, and perhaps the vast majority of the public are comfortable with it. So, you know.
Well, so the first thing is, again, when I came forward, my goal, right, was not to change the policy, was not to change the law. I'm not the president of the internet, and I'm not telling people how they want to live. Again, it was about democracy, not surveillance. We needed to know what was going on so we could express our will. If people say this is the world they want to live in, that's okay. But what we've actually seen is that while legislatures, political bodies, even courts in some cases have failed in their responsibilities, and others have done well in reform laws and sort of change policies, we have seen that technologists and engineers, scientists and academics have started to create new means of enforcing our human rights, right? That may mean, yeah, the British intelligence agency can't get into your phone if the engineers do their job well enough, which is extremely difficult and I wouldn't count on nowadays. But it's certainly better than it was before. For example, more than 50% of the world's communications, as measured through at least Google's browser, are now encrypted, which means they can't be read just over the wire easily. Whereas previously, the majority of them were electronically naked. Anybody could look at them, record them, even your internet service provider, even the guy next to you at the coffee shop. And this is a positive step forward. But even if you think, well, look, I trust the government, I don't care about the government, my government's great. You have to understand that the internet is largely borderless, right? There are some regimes that are trying to change that. Russia's one of them. But there's a reality that the laws of the United Kingdom don't do anything for you. As soon as your communications cross the border into France or the United States or Denmark, Germany, over to Russia, over to China. But science, math, they will, right? And there's a beautiful thing in the idea that a British student who's young and bright and realizes that even if I trust my government, right, other governments will exploit these vulnerabilities, these windows into the private lives of civil society. They can come up with a new algorithm, a new method, a new way of communicating that instantly provides guarantees of people's rights, not just in your country, but in all others, ones where people don't have the same recourse of courts and laws and civil society.
Just wanted to pick up on this. The folks that I've spoken to who are connected to the intelligence agencies have made a couple of points to me. Number one, and it's a fairly mundane point, but it's worth making, they don't have time to be ferreting around in people's private lives. And number two, at a time when there's an elevated terror threat in the UK, your disclosures caused them a lot of problems that worried them as to whether they could perform their jobs effectively, which is a national security role. They still regard you, well, somewhere on the borders of a traitor, I'm not sure whether they'd use that word, that you caused these people a huge headache at a time when they did not need that and were trying to do the right thing.
Sure, and I mean, look, this is a common argument, it's a reflexive argument, and it's one that they have to make, right? Because their job is to be conservative. It's like hiring a lawyer, right? The lawyer doesn't tell you to take the risky action, they tell you to take the one that has the least risks. But if you want to live in a free and open society, you have to take risks. And what they're talking about are basically efforts to change the topic of the conversation from the theoretical risks of journalism in an open society instead of the concrete harms of their policies and programs, which we have even court decisions in the UK itself saying violated human rights. And we've had them in Europe, we've had them in the United States. And the bottom line is this, we're now 5 years on, right? And if they want to say this was a risky act, that's fine, they can say that. But if they want to say it's a harmful act, they have no evidence of that. And that's really an extraordinary thing, right? Because we've had a lot of governments, not just one, who are, let's say, a little cross with me, right? And if they had a face and a name, someone who had died, an attack that had gotten through, but for sort of these stories in the newspaper, do you think that wouldn't be in the public, right? And of course, the answer is no. Controlled leaks, official leaks, these happen all the time when they're to the advantage of these agencies. And the reality is this, the job of police, the job of intelligence services is supposed to be difficult. It's supposed to be hard unless you're living under, some authoritarian nightmare. And the reason for this is so that they only use their capabilities when they're absolutely necessary, not when it's simply easy, not when it's simply there. So if they say, oh, we don't have time to do this, good, right? That's how we want it to be. That should be by design, rather than incidentally, simply because they haven't hired enough people.
I'm going to open up to questions in a second. I just want to ask, just lastly, Cambridge Analytica, obviously it's been a huge story, it's caused Facebook a huge amount of trouble, and you referenced the empty chairing of Mark Zuckerberg in the committee the other day. I'll be honest, some people I spoke to just look at the Cambridge Analytica thing and is bemused. They can't really see where the story is. As far as they're concerned, this was just Facebook's business model. I just wonder what you make of it. When it came out, were you surprised? Were you appalled?
I mean, this is really the logical progression. When you see all of these companies enriching themselves to extraordinary degrees, being more powerful, more influential, more wealthy than companies that have been around for decades, right? And really control sectors that have infrastructure, bricks on the ground and concrete. And instantly, sort of these upstarts can arrive and they can really shape laws. They can go, look, I don't care about your parliament. Your parliament. Who cares about parliament, right? I'm an international company. This kind of thing is disruptive, right? And disruption can be a good thing. We want people to be able to break orthodoxies. We want people to be able to engage in acts of heresy because that's where progress comes from. However, at the same time, we need to think about values. We need to think about accountability. We need to think about how we sort of handle the protection of our rights, of our tradition, of our influence, the public's influence in society, because increasingly it's beginning to vanish and it's being replaced by these institutions, right? And it could be Facebook, right? It could be a Russian hacking campaign in the election, right? It could be a US election campaign in Italy, right? These kind of things, this is what intelligence services do. This is how they view their job. And this is also where companies view their ultimate loyalty is not to the public, it's not to society, it's to their owners, right? And those might be shareholders, might be a non-public company. The bottom line is, what is democracy's defense of last resort? And in all of this, the thread through all the controversies we've talked about tonight, I would argue it's the press, because we cannot protect ourselves from that which we cannot perceive. And this sort of rise of secrecy from both governments and corporations is a very toxic and corrosive thing.
Sorry, I sort of come on, just one last one. Look, all the things you've talked about, suppression of dissidents, use of mobile malware, cynical use of social media, it has to be said, a lot of the fingers point at Russia and particularly Vladimir Putin's administration. The jurisdiction in which you found yourself is front and center in the slightly dystopian vision you paint of the world. What happens when your visa, as I understand it, runs till 2020? Are you itching for the opportunity to get out of that environment or sort of stuck with it?
Well, look, for people who don't recall sort of the timeline, I never chose to be in Russia. This was not my plan. I was actually en route to Latin America when the Secretary of State at the time, John Kerry, froze my passport to trap me in Russia. And that, was a very unusual thing. Somebody who is giving them the benefit of the doubt would go, oh, well, they didn't know where we would go next. And they wanted to make sure he was, not able to go on to paradise or whatever. Someone who's a little less indulgent might go, well, they know this is a stain that won't wash away. Even though one would presume if the US government thought I was somebody who's up to no good, right? I was somebody who was a traitor, who was a spy, who was working against the public interest. Russia would be the last place in the world you would want to stick someplace like that, right? But instead, they were all too comfortable with it. And so I ended up trapped in this damn Russian airport for like 40 days. And while I'm there, I applied for asylum in 21 different countries around the world, right? These are places that are not Russia. And it's not until all of these people say no, or when one of them said yes, Evo Morales, the president of Bolivia, the EU closed their airspace to his presidential plane, which is a violation of international law. And they would not let it cross, I think it was Spain, Italy, and France, until he landed. He was forced down in Austria because they ran out of fuel, and he agreed to let his diplomatic aircraft be searched to see if I was on board. So the bottom line is, I can't control where I am, but I can control what I say. And look, if I've learned one thing about what it takes to keep a democracy, what it takes to keep a free society, we have to have a willingness to say, look, no matter what it comes down to, no matter the costs, there are some things that I'm not willing to compromise. And I would rather be without a state than without a voice.
Great stuff. So, So we're going to go to audience questions now. I'm going to try and be fair about this. I'm going to try and go left and right, front to back. So hands up if you've got questions. I'll come one in the front straight away, and I'll come to this chap here first of all. Again, name and affiliation if you can, but it's up to you.
My name is Patricia. Hi. Everything that's going on in China right now with the social care, yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Oh, I do.
Pretty scary stuff.
Yeah.
What do you think of it?
I think China is what the future looks like if we don't do anything about this. You know, one of the things that's constant, and I hope somebody asks me about, you know, why we care about privacy when we get there. But there is this idea that if you got nothing to hide, you got nothing to fear. And we like to think that's like this liberal progressive thing. But when you look at what the Chinese are saying, they say the same things the British are saying, the same things the Americans are saying, the same things the Germans and French are saying. Yes, we collect it all, but it's only in our database. We only need it if it's necessary. We're not going to look at everything. We don't have time for that, right? If you have nothing to hide, you have nothing to fear, is what he's saying there. And she says, yes, that's true. Citizens don't have to worry. China, again, is just when you follow the road that we're on, to the point of its termination, right? That's the realization of the trend. The technology is only getting better. And if we are not increasing the restrictions on our own willingness to exploit that technology for antisocial purposes, we will have no one to blame but ourselves for the world we end up in.
Up over here on the right-hand side in the grey jumper.
Hi, thank you. My name's Alan. As you've said, Israeli company, Saudis, Russians, China, America, US, you've also said there's no law on the internet. So in really practical terms, the genie's out the bottle. What do you suggest we do about it?
So this is a great question. And this gets to something that a lot of sort of the hawkish types say. In every controversy, whether it's, you know, nuclear disarmament or whatever, they go, oh, unilateral disarmament, right? We can't get rid of cluster munitions because the worst people on Earth have them. We can't get rid of biological weapons because the worst people on Earth have them. Are we really the same as the worst people on Earth? Are the worst people on Earth on a level field with us? Or is it okay to cede some level of advantage to them, to distinguish ourselves from them? And this is something that is sort of weird in this new Cold War. That's distinctive from the last one. Last Cold War had the Iron Curtain, right? Had the Stasi, had all these guys. And to think that their, you know, methods of surveillance were better than ours because they had a technological advantage or they had more people or whatever is fantasy. In economic terms, in technological terms, right? We were crushing them in the competition. And yet, we argued, we didn't need to do those things. We would not do those things because that is how you could tell who was on the right side of history and who was on the wrong side of history, right? Who was a free society and who was not. We don't hear that rhetoric anymore. Instead, we see this ruthlessly pragmatic language of utilitarianism going, oh, no, we need to be exactly the same. They're doing this, we're doing this. The reality is this, technology is a little bit different. In that with nuclear arms, right, if we throw away our nuclear arms, we can't take them away from our adversaries. But when we're talking about technological vulnerabilities and exploits, we can, right? When we're talking about that sort of Israeli company and their hacks, they find a hole in the iPhone, then they start selling it, right? These people can use it. But what they're selling is just knowledge of this hole. The hole exists in our phones, right? You know, Theresa May's phone will have the same hole in it that the Chinese president's phone would have, if presuming they're using these phones, of course. It's a little bit different unless you're Angela Merkel. But the idea here is it's a universal vulnerability. And if we permit these kind of companies to find vulnerabilities in critical infrastructure that everyone relies upon around the world and profit from these rather than closing them, rather than reporting them to Apple, and Apple fixes this hole, so now we are all safer. It can't be used against us anymore. We're in a problematic dynamic. So a better policy here would be, instead of incentivizing offense, which is what we're doing now when we're permitting sales of $55 million, right, from authoritarian regimes for a way to get into an iPhone. Instead, we create enormous incentives, sort of new work programs for people to go into defense, where when they find these holes, they are rewarded for closing them. We find new methods, new dynamics, new models of programming, and new liability regimes for ensuring that companies that are selling products, particularly Internet of Things type products that you install once and then you never look at for the next 20 years, but it's constantly connected to the internet, that these things, there's a much greater benefit to them to make them as secure as we possibly can, rather than just going, oh, that's not our problem, that's our customer's problem. And this means, just to finish it up, when the Russians, find some vulnerability, when the Chinese find some vulnerability, when the Israelis find some vulnerability, right, we can close this hole and it's out of their hands, right? We can take their nuclear weapons away.
Question on left-hand side. Oh, there's one all the way at the back, chap in the black coats. Behind you. There you go, all the way at the back.
Good evening, sir. I just had some questions. We talked a lot about the Russians, and you're currently there. I've been there too. I've been in Russia too, and I can understand your unease. I have some questions related to Ukraine. It's been in the news a lot lately, and for the past 5 years, there's been a war. So, sorry, say again, sir?
Could you narrow it down to one on the Ukraine? We're quite pressed for time. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, just Ukraine. We have Crimea, we have the invasion into East Ukraine, we have the recent attack on the Navy. We have, in Great Britain, we have guys who decide to go see a cathedral, but mysteriously connected to...
Big fans of architecture, yeah.
Big fans of architecture, yeah. I plan on seeing Salisbury with my buddies this weekend, so... What do you recommend for Ukraine? What do you recommend for the world? I mean, we have on Contactee, for example, documented evidence where the separatists said that they shot down Malaysian Airlines. Sure. Yet,
so this is way outside my wheelhouse for one. Like suggesting the future of Ukraine is a little beyond my expertise. But when we look at the problems of these conflicts and strife, right, we need to have a more interconnected, mutually reliant world. The politics of conflict are constantly going to be attacks on the progress of society. A previous American president once said, every bomb, every tank, every plane that we are building is ultimately a theft from our children. It's a school that could be built, it's a hospital that could be lit. And everybody wants to pick sides on this, go against Russia, right? Because Russia breaks a lot of rules. Russia's aggressive. And Russia, we don't want them invading countries. And then people go, Russia now is an angel in comparison. Maybe that's true, right? Certainly everybody's going to have sympathy for the victim. But we also have to remember that there are political forces that are exploiting this, right, for their own domestic gain. And this is the thing that I think people miss. It's like these old monster movies. People pick sides and they go, oh, I want Godzilla to win against this other monster. When monsters fight, it's the city that suffers. What's happening in Ukraine is terrible, right? It's inexcusable. We shouldn't stand for this kind of thing. But at the same time, when people go, because of this victimization, we're going to give basically a pass to a government that's obviously corrupt, like openly corrupt. Even people who are very anti-Russia, who are like hawkish foreign policy think tanks, are like there's massive corruption on there. and go, oh, let's not worry about that now. How do we create societies where we don't have to pick and choose between bad guys? Instead, we have good governments that are working in the public interest, right? And we don't have them being attacked and invaded and sort of eroded. And the only way this works is through cooperation.
Good stuff. A question here at the front, and then after.
Hi, I'm Etienne, and thank you for fascinating insights. My question is around Balkanization, and certainly at the moment when you have this intersection between technology companies and states with Huawei and Kaspersky, where do you see this ending? I saw in RT they were talking about how companies should stop using Microsoft in Russia because that's. So it'd be quite interesting your insights there, Ed. Thank you.
Yeah, so in general, I don't think anybody should be using Microsoft operating systems nowadays because the latest version you don't own. It's sort of a permanent subscription model. There's enormous amounts of telemetry that are basically beaconing out from your system, sending details of your activities, the way you're using the system, its configuration, that you are literally not permitted to turn off. Even on the enterprise version, you can only turn the telemetry down, but you can't turn it off. But does this mean sort of we need to retreat into this kind of nationalism, right? No, I think that's a very dark future, and again goes against the direction we need to be moving into, which is mutual cooperation. But how do we get there? We need a kind of trust, and this is something where I start advocating for intelligence, which is a very rare thing for me to do. How do we affirm trust, right? How do we establish this? And the reality is we need to be, rather than further embracing secrecy the way we see happening so popularly among all these governments, even in what we think to be liberal open societies, we need to be acting more openly, more transparently, so that when they spy, right, there's no take other than confirming that our public positions are accurate. A lot of people, probably some of our friends in the audience, go, I'm being naive. And maybe it's true, maybe I am, right? But again, it gets back to this concept of risk. If we do not try new things, if we simply accept the status quo and constantly build walls, armor ourselves off, try to protect our systems from foreign influence, right? Try to protect our internet from foreign connections. What we end up with is a walled garden, which might be very nice for a time. But then when we have some crisis, even something as simple as a drought, we will find that we have no way to keep our plants alive and we have nowhere to go because we found ourselves in a world full of walls.
Good stuff. Question at the back. Yes, the chap there.
Hi, Edward. My name is Luke. I work for a cybersecurity firm called Darktrace. My question is, given the embarrassment and the risk that WikiLeaks pose to security services, what can they do and what are they doing to prevent the next Edward Snowden?
Yeah, I think this is it's a good question, but it's kind of from the wrong direction. The right question is, what can security services do so that they do not fear another Edward Snowden? As we've said, the U.S. presidents looked into this. We've had 5 years for them to do harm assessments and analysis. And just as with the Manning case, which was WikiLeaks back in 2009, when it happened, they said, oh, blood on their hands, blood on their hands. It's going to cause all of these crises, collapses, people are going to die. And then when Manning was captured and tortured and then eventually put in prison and eventually sentenced, the judge asked the government to make arguments for harm, show what happened, show who was hurt. The government went, we can't do that. We don't need to do that, so don't worry about that. And if in now, basically, we've got a 10-year history of very wide leaks, and we don't have a very wide history of harm, perhaps the reality is we're classifying more things than we need to. And we have a lot of US officials who have said different things. One of them made an argument that 75% of everything that was classified needlessly. Another one said 90%. And even in my own case, this is one of the sort of unusual things, the same guys who were denouncing me, saying, you know, I should be hanged or droned back in 2013, just a few years later, and this is the guy who was actually the head of the investigation into me, by the way, said they should have disclosed these programs themselves. They erred much too far on the side of secrecy than they needed to, because they believe if they had made the case to the public, they would have been granted the powers. And you know, the reality is maybe this is true. So why didn't they? Why shouldn't they? This is not an argument that there are no legitimate secrets. This is not an argument that, you know, we need to publish our troop movements on Twitter. Of course not, right? But when we talk about the broad programs, the powers, the policies, the outline of operations that define the boundaries of our rights in a free society, if the public cannot be permitted to know this, if even our enemies cannot be permitted to know this, what a right means, how it applies, we don't have a free society. We have replaced the idea of informed consent with a sort of pageantry, demonstrative democracy, where we act like our votes have meaning, and they pretend that they're responding to the public will. But how can we direct the future of our society if we don't know what it's doing?
We have a question down at the front here, and we've probably got time for one more. So I'm going to go that lady there and maybe that lady there, but we'll see how we do.
So, Paul, my question is, are major internet firms, whether they're Chinese, Russian, or UK American, have really centralized things? You know, there's been a few winners. Our governments also tend towards centralism. If one of the issues that we have with our democracy is this tendency to centralism and authoritarianism, what could we change about our internet that would provide a counterbalance and possibly the start of a journey towards openness and transparency that you think is an important component in changing the landscape?
It's a great question. It's one that I'm probably not the best qualified to answer. But when we talk about it just on the broad level, centralization is a kind of attack on the original idea of the internet. I don't know how many of you in the room were nerdy enough that you were really involved in the pre-2000s internet, right? Particularly the pre-World Wide Web internet. But the idea was that everybody was a publisher. We weren't just blindly consuming. We weren't just going to Instagram or Facebook. You know, these kind of services didn't exist. Everything was a dialogue. Everything was an exchange. And what this meant was every node was both a receiver, sure, but also a sender of original content. That has changed, and we're no longer publishing, certainly not from our own computers. Even when we do create original content, we send that to someone else. We hand it over to a company, and we tell them to basically hang it out on their shingle for people to enjoy. But now we don't really own it. We don't have a control over it because of these licensing terms that no one reads and no one understands because we're not lawyers. But when we think about the knock-on effects, where this leads, this centralization, if everybody who's writing every letter does not send it to the person that they want to read that letter, just because it's inconvenient, and then they send it to a big sorting pile in the middle of town, and everybody's just supposed to go and pick up the letters that are meant for them, some people will break those rules. And this is really sort of the original sin of the 2013 disclosures that really got people going, which was the idea that these massive centralized repositories in our digital lives, the Googles, the Facebooks, the YouTubes, you know, the Yahoos, the Microsofts, these guys were sharing everything that they had with these governments, in many cases beyond what the law required. Now, that's not to say everything that they're doing was strictly unlawful, right? But there was no authorizing legislation. They had no obligation to go along with the government here. And they very easily could have said to the government, you know, come back with a warrant, come back with a law. we abide by the laws. And the problem with this is when we get back into that bordering argument from before, the Balkanization. What are you going to do when China creates the next big advance on the internet in technology? And now it's a Chinese company that we are all reliant on, the central hub in our great wheel of technology. And China will go, oh, don't worry. Everything that we do follows legal process. Everything that we do has courts, right? Yeah, China's got courts, and they're happy to stamp any piece of paper, just like our secret courts are willing to do the same thing. We don't have to be the same as China. We don't have to be morally equivalent to recognize the dangers of centralization. The solution for the internet's problems as they are today is a re-decentralization. And interestingly enough, we see this being championed by a man, Tim Berners-Lee, who actually created the World Wide Web and looks at what it has become today with a kind of regret, because he rightly recognizes the kind of activities we see happening, not just by governments, but also companies, are a kind of predation upon all of our private lives and society broadly.
Adam Ware, we're close to time. If it's a quick question, a quick answer, would you take one more? Is that okay?
Sure.
Great. Blonde person there, blonde hair person, and yeah, a quick one is good.
Good evening. What, if anything, can individual citizens do, civilians do even, to protect a free and open society?
The very first thing is to care, and to, don't be afraid to say you care. I can't tell you how many times I get this question that goes, oh, you look at the world, nobody cares. And I got to tell you, particularly people say young people don't care because they use Facebook, they got smartphones, all this stuff. I've given talks at universities around the world. And the interesting thing is young people actually care more than older folks because their lives are more reliant. They revolve around these digital systems. And they've all had the time and experience, thanks to these youthful indiscretions, right, that now are permanently crystallized and captured, of seeing the costs and consequences of the abuse of sort of a pervasive, persistent memory against them. The right to privacy is so many things. It's the chance to try something and be wrong. It's the chance to make a mistake and to not be judged for it, to think and believe without being sort of subject to the tyranny of the majority as to the quality of that idea. People don't realize how important, how fundamental that is to a free and open society. You go to the US Constitution, you go to the Magna Carta, all of these different things. Why do you have a right to a trial? Where does that derive from? Where are they finding that initial right from? The right to privacy is the foundation of all other rights. The trial right is because you have an ownership right in yourself that the state recognizes and must overcome, right, before they can imprison you. Freedom of speech doesn't mean very much if you have nothing to say, nothing original, nothing different. Freedom of worship, if you didn't decide for yourself what to believe or just inherited it, it's popular, it's mandated by society, what does that actually mean? The word private property, it's something for yourself, right? Something that belongs to you, not to society. Privacy, ultimately, is the right to the self. And so many people today have forgotten this. Arguing that you don't care about privacy because you've got nothing to hide is like arguing that, you don't care about freedom of speech because you have nothing to say. It's not just dumb, it's illiberal. And when we look at these things, right, when we look at what it matters, when we look at what these arguments are doing, again, nothing to hide comes from the Nazis. It's a line from Joseph Goebbels, their minister of propaganda. And if we see someone making that kind of argument today, that should worry us. And if it doesn't, you should care. That's the first step, right? You don't need to be a technologist. You don't need to dedicate your life to the fight. If you can, great, do it. You'll create a better world for your children. If you can't, give to those who do. Support the organizations that are, bringing cases against the UK government, right? Against the US government, against the Russian government, right? Against the Chinese government. Get engaged in some small way. Because the question is, if you don't, who will, right? And it's very easy when the harms and the costs of these kind of policies and programs feel invisible. A lot of people go, oh, people don't care about what's going on. And the answer is, do they really not care? Really? And if you ask them and you say what's happening, they actually go, well, I don't like that at all. but they feel powerless. It's not that they don't care, it's that they don't see it and they feel like they can't change it. The reality is when we look at every abusive regime, every harmful authority, going back to slavery in humanity, these things don't get abolished, they don't get done away with until you see the abuses, until they become personal, until they become real, until they stop becoming something you read about and start becoming something you feel. What I worry about this moment, this historical moment, is that things are a little bit different. And this is because now these powers, these authorities can be applied to us. They can be applied to our neighbors. We don't feel them. We don't see them. We don't notice them. We know they're collecting everything we have. We know they could do these things, but we don't actually see them do it. And this leads us down that Chinese road all too quickly to where we reach a point where we realize we have lost our power, which is really what privacy is about, what that ownership right is about. Privacy isn't about something to hide. It's about something to protect. It's about your right to the self, your ability to be and think and speak and influence the world around you. Right? And if we lose that, and we don't see it, if people creep in and take it away from us, what happens is that now we can't create the critical mass to work against it. Because the instant you start developing your argument, the instant you start coordinating with friends, with students in your class, with people in your college, your colleagues, it's noticed. It pops in the system and they go, oh, we don't have time to look at that, right? They don't have time now. It gets easier with every passing year. And what happens when the priorities change? State security, national security, that is not the same thing as public security. And that's something we all too quickly forget. Stability, protection from subversion, these are the same arguments that we heard from, Russia's FSB, the KGB, the Stasi. Pick your example. Even the FBI in the United States declared the greatest threat to national security back in the 1960s was Dr. Martin Luther King, the greatest civil rights activist we ever had. And it was 2 days after he gave his most famous speech. Ladies and gentlemen, there are so many things that we have to deal with. You've got jobs, you've got lives, you've got families. Sometimes we just want to escape, sometimes we just want to get by. But I want you to remember that idea of citizenry, that idea of civic participation. People get the governments they deserve. If we sit by and watch this happen, because it's hard or it's inconvenient or it's difficult, our children will not inherit the same rights we ourselves enjoy. They will have a narrowed subset of those. And it will be their parents to blame. But it's not inevitable. It doesn't have to be that way. If we speak, if we care, if we coordinate, if we act, and this is the final thing, we can make the future what we want. Yes, we sit at a fork in the road today. Yes, we can see the dark futures. Yes, we can see the foreign interference. Yes, we can see the aggression. Yes, we can see the spying. We can see all of these things. But if you look at the history of humanity, us coming out of the dark swamp, the jungle of history, to where we've gotten today, it has always been hard. It has never been easy, and power has never admitted anything without a demand. The reforms we get are the ones that we demand, and those alone. And remember, ladies and gentlemen, it is not enough to believe in something. Belief is powerful, belief is important, but belief doesn't change a damn thing. If you believe in something, stand for something. Because if you look at my story, right, all of these people who are angry at this young guy who's, not that special. I'm not, the head of an agency. Maybe I'm a horrible traitor. Maybe I'm the worst person on earth, right? It doesn't matter if I'm Mother Teresa or I'm Adolf Hitler. What matters is what was going on, and would you rather not know? And I want you to think as you go through your life, as you look at all these moral complexities and challenges and friction that we deal with in our daily life, right down to the beggar on the street. We've only got time for so much. We've only got the ability to help so many. But we also have a line. And we also recognize there's a level of incivility, of inhumanity, injustice we can tolerate. And then there's that one step beyond. The thing where we won't just believe it's wrong, we will say it's wrong. And we will do what we can to stop it. Because if I'm one guy, if I'm just some voice, you know, I have to lay my head down in Moscow, but I can speak to you here in London. That says something. That says the world is changing. That says the old bad tools of political repression are beginning to fail. Not even exile works anymore. And that's a moment for hope. Because yeah, we're dealing with extraordinary forces. Yeah, we're dealing with extraordinary opposition. But one voice can change the world, and it can be yours. When you see something, say something, but say it for the public. Thank you.
Edward Snowden, спасибо большое для вашего времени. До свидания. Thank you for your time and goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and I hope to be with you guys at the next session. I think March of next week. Thank you so much. Good night.
Thank you.